You know, in all my years covering galactic news, I never thought I'd see the day when the entire Galactic Council would collectively wet themselves over 3 missing children. But then again, these weren't just any children. These were the cubs of Commander Vexstar, Supreme War Chief of the Draknari Empire, a species that had spent the last 1,000 years making everyone else in the galaxy sleep with one eye open. Picture this: 7 feet of pure reptilian nightmare, scales that could deflect plasma rounds, claws that could tear through titanium like tissue paper, and a disposition that made rabid honey badgers look like therapy animals. That's Vexstar on a good day. On a bad day, well, let's just say entire star systems had learned to apologize preemptively just in case they might have offended him somehow. So when his 3 little cubs vanished from Krex Prime, the supposedly most secure fortress world in Draknari space, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Every ambassador in the Galactic Council suddenly discovered urgent business in distant nebulae. Trade routes were mysteriously rerouted. Even the war-hungry Zortha Confederacy issued a statement expressing their deep concern and offering thoughts and prayers, which was roughly equivalent to a pack of wolves sending condolence cards. The emergency session was called within hours, and let me tell you, watching a room full of the galaxy's most powerful beings try to explain to an increasingly agitated apex predator that his children had simply evaporated was like watching a support group for people with death wishes. Enter Agent Blimbert of the Galactic Investigation Division, a pale, nervous creature from Zerion 7 who looked like someone had stretched a worried expression over a coat hanger and given it a badge. Poor Blimbert had drawn the short straw, career-wise speaking, and now found himself standing before Vexstar trying to explain how 3 small predators had managed to disappear from a world that had never, not once, experienced a successful infiltration. "Commander Vexstar," Blimbert stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager asking someone to prom, "I assure you that the GID is deploying all available resources to locate your offspring. Our preliminary investigation suggests—" Vexstar's growl cut through the chamber like a chainsaw through butter. "Your preliminary investigation suggests incompetence, Agent Blimbert. My cubs do not simply vanish. They are Draknari. They are warriors born. Even as younglings, they could track, hunt, and kill most species in this pathetic assembly." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as every delegate suddenly found their shoes absolutely fascinating. Because here's the thing about the Draknari that made this situation so pants-wettingly terrifying. They weren't just physically superior. They were also absolutely, completely devoted to family. Mess with the Draknari's cubs, and you didn't just anger one 7-foot killing machine, you angered an entire empire of 7-foot killing machines who viewed vengeance as both an art form and a religious obligation. Blimbert cleared his throat, a sound like a dying air filter. "Perhaps, Commander, we should consider all possibilities. Maybe they simply wandered off? Children do tend to—" The silence that followed was so complete you could hear stars dying in distant galaxies. "Zux Blimbert," Vexstar said, his voice dropping to that special register that usually preceded someone becoming past tense. "Are you suggesting that my cubs, trained from birth in survival and combat, protected by automated defense systems that could vaporize a small moon, simply decided to go for a stroll?" And that, ladies and gentlemen, was when the Galactic Council realized they had a problem that required a very special kind of stupid to solve. The kind of stupid that only one species in the galaxy possessed in sufficient quantities. Now, if you're not familiar with humanity's reputation in galactic circles, let me paint you a picture. Humans are what happens when evolution gives a species just enough intelligence to be dangerous, just enough curiosity to be annoying, and just enough stubbornness to ignore every single piece of sensible advice the universe has to offer. They're like that friend who fixes complex problems by hitting them with a hammer, and somehow it actually works. The official Galactic Council database lists humans under the category of inexplicably effective problem solvers, which is diplomatic speak for, we have no idea how these lunatics keep succeeding, but they do, and it makes us deeply uncomfortable. So when Chancellor Vorpnex suggested calling in the humans, the reaction was about what you'd expect. Half the council looked like they'd rather invite a black hole to the party, while the other half looked like they were seriously considering it as the safer option. "The humans?" squeaked Ambassador Trilnox, her crystalline form practically vibrating with anxiety. "Are we that desperate?" "They solved the Epsilon crisis," Vorpin pointed out, his tentacles writhing, in what passed for a diplomatic shrug among his species. Merely solve the Epsilon crisis by convincing two warring empires to settle their differences with something called a dance-off, Trilnox protested. That's not diplomacy. That's effective, Vextal rumbled, and suddenly everyone remembered that there was still a very large, very angry predator in the room. Call them. And that's how Detective Jake Murphy found himself, hauled out of his perfectly reasonable Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, and stuffed into a diplomatic transport bound for the galactic capital. Jake was what you might call aggressively average-looking, the kind of guy who could blend into any crowd by virtue of being exactly what you'd expect a human cop to look like, if you'd never actually met a human cop before. His partner on this little interdimensional field trip was Dr. Rita Kowalski, a xenobiologist who had spent most of her career studying alien life through telescopes and databases, and was now practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of meeting actual, real aliens. Rita had the kind of enthusiasm that could power a small city, and the kind of scientific curiosity that had probably gotten her into trouble more times than she cared to count. "Oh my God, Jake, look at this place," Rita practically squealed as their transport docked at the council station. "Do you see the atmospheric processors? And those bioluminescent guidance systems? This is incredible." Jake, who had seen enough weird stuff in his 20 years as a Chicago cop to remain unimpressed by most things, including apparently intergalactic space stations, just grunted and checked his service weapon. "Rita, we're here to find some missing kids, not to geek out over alien plumbing." "But it's not plumbing, it's a complex environmental control system that—" "Rita, right. Missing kids, got it." Their arrival at the council chambers was, to put it mildly, awkward. Picture this. You've got several dozen of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, beings who have mastered faster-than-light travel, energy manipulation, and diplomatic relations, spanning thousands of worlds, all trying very hard not to stare at the two humans who just walked in, looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Jake surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone who had walked into more than his fair share of situations that were about to go sideways. "So," he said, his voice carrying that special blend of authority and barely concealed irritation that only cops seem to master, "which one of you is the guy whose kids are missing?" The collective intake of breath from the assembled delegates could have powered a wind farm. You just don't address the supreme war chief of the Draknari Empire like he's some guy who lost his car keys. Vextar, however, seemed almost amused by the human's directness. He rose to his full height, all 7 feet of scaled death machine, and fixed Jake with a stare that had made veteran warriors reconsider their life choices. "I am Commander Vextar. You are the human investigators?" Jake looked up at the towering predator without so much as a blink. "Detective Murphy, Chicago PD. This is Dr. Kowalski. We're here to find your kids and figure out who was stupid enough to take them in the first place." And just like that, Rita chose that exact moment to do what Rita always did when meeting new species. "Oh, wow. Your scale patterns are fascinating. Is the coloration seasonal? And those claws, are they retractable? How does your species handle parental bonding? Do you have ritualistic—" "Rita," Jake interrupted, "maybe save the National Geographic interview for after we solve the case." But something strange happened. Instead of the expected diplomatic catastrophe, Vextar's expression shifted slightly. If you knew what to look for, you might have recognized something almost like approval in those predatory eyes. Because here were beings who didn't seem to care about his reputation, his species, or the fact that he could probably kill everyone in the room before security could react. They cared about his children. And that, as it turned out, was exactly the kind of stupid the situation required. Now, if you've ever watched humans work, you'll know they have this peculiar habit of completely ignoring established protocols in favor of what they call common sense, which is apparently neither common nor particularly sensible by galactic standards, but somehow gets results anyway. Jake's first move was to completely bypass Agent Blimbert, who had prepared a comprehensive briefing packet, complete with witness statements, security footage analysis, and a 17-point investigative timeline that would have made any reasonable investigator weep with joy. "Yeah, I'm not reading all that," Jake said, setting the packet aside without even opening it. "Commander, when did you last see your kids?" Vextar blinked slowly, the kind of blink that suggested he was recalibrating his expectations. 3 rotations ago. They were in their secured chambers for the sleep cycle." "Okay, and when you say secured chambers, we're talking what level of security here?" "Biometric locks, automated defense turrets, force field barriers, and atmospheric monitors," Blimbert interjected, clearly trying to regain some semblance of control over his own investigation. "The security is impenetrable." Jake looked at him with the expression cops reserve for people who use the word impenetratable about anything. Uh-huh. And yet somehow 3 kids managed to penetrate it. Rita, what's the first rule of crime scenes? Rita, who was currently examining the chamber walls with a handheld scanner and making excited noises, looked up. If someone got out, someone else probably got in? Exactly. So either these kids figured out how to teleport, or someone with access helped them leave. The silence that followed this observation was broken only by the sound of several galactic dignitaries realizing that the human had just solved in 30 seconds what their best investigators had been puzzling over for 3 days. Impossible, Blimbert sputtered. All access codes are strictly monitored. Every individual with clearance has been accounted for. Jake walked over to the chamber entrance, completely ignoring the do not disturb crime scene barriers that had been so carefully erected. Rita, come look at this. Jake, we probably shouldn't. Rita. She sighed and joined him at the doorway, pulling out her tricorder. What am I looking for? You tell me. You're the one with the fancy science degree. Rita ran her scanner over the doorframe, frowning at the readings. There are trace amounts of industrial lubricant here. Not the kind used in normal maintenance. This is specialized stuff, the kind you'd use to... Oh, what? Vextar had moved closer, his massive frame looming over them in a way that would have sent most beings running for therapy. Someone disabled the door mechanisms, Rita said, looking up at the predator with the kind of expression she usually reserved for particularly interesting bacterial cultures. From the inside. These readings suggest someone spent time carefully dismantling the security protocols without triggering any alarms. Jake nodded. Inside job. Someone the kids trusted enough to let them into their room, someone with enough technical knowledge to bypass the security, and someone with access to specialized equipment. Blimbert was starting to look like someone had just explained quantum physics using finger puppets. But that would mean someone on your investigation team is either criminally incompetent or criminally complicit, Jake finished. And given that we're talking about kids who could probably take down a small army, I'm leaning toward complicit. What happened next was probably the most entertaining diplomatic incident of the decade. Vextar's growl started somewhere around the frequency that makes your bones ache and worked its way down to the range that makes your soul question its life choices. Every security officer in the room suddenly found their weapons very interesting, while every diplomat suddenly found the exits very appealing. You are suggesting, Vextar said, each word carefully enunciated in the way that suggested someone was about to become a cautionary tale, that someone I trusted betrayed my family? I'm not suggesting anything, Jake replied, apparently immune to the whole impending doom atmosphere that had settled over the chamber. I'm telling you that's what the evidence says. The question is, which one of your trusted allies thought kidnapping baby predators was a good career move? Rita, meanwhile, had wandered over to the window and was doing that thing she did when she was processing information, which involved a lot of excited muttering and occasional exclamations of, "Oh, that's clever." Rita, please tell me you've figured something out, because I think we're about 30 seconds away from this becoming a much shorter investigation. Actually, yes, she spun around, nearly dropping her scanner in her excitement. Look, if someone disabled the security from inside, they had to know the Cubs' routine, right? And they had to time it perfectly to avoid the automated patrols. But here's the thing. The atmospheric readings show that the Cubs were sedated. Sedated how? Airborne agent, something that would work on Draknari physiology. That's not something you can just pick up at the local space pharmacy. You'd need specific knowledge of their biological systems, access to controlled substances, and a delivery method that wouldn't trigger environmental alarms. Jake was starting to smile, which in his experience usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. So we're looking for someone with security clearance, technical expertise, access to specialized equipment, detailed knowledge of Draknari biology, and connections to controlled substances. He turned to look at Agent Blimbert, who had gone very pale and was starting to sweat in ways that suggested his cardiovascular system was having serious doubts about his life choices. Gosh, Agent Blimbert, Jake said, his voice dripping with the kind of false concern that made experienced criminals confess just to make it stop. That's a pretty specific skill set. I don't suppose you know anyone who fits that description? And that was when everyone in the room realized that the humans hadn't just solved the case. They'd walked into a room full of the galaxy's best and brightest, ignored all their careful procedures and diplomatic protocols, and cracked it wide open in less than an hour. Which, when you think about it, was probably the most human thing they could have done. Now you might think that cornering a corrupt galactic agent would be the hard part of this investigation. You would be wrong. The hard part was getting Agent Blimbert to stop hyperventilating long enough to actually confess. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Blimbert wheezed, looking like someone had just told him his warranty had expired on everything he'd ever owned. It was supposed to be simple, clean, no one was supposed to get hurt. Jake had seen enough guilty parties to know when someone was about to spill everything, so he did what every good cop does in that situation. He shut up and let the suspect talk themselves into a confession. There's this guy, C, goes by the name Grotch, runs the biggest exotic animal trafficking ring in the Outer Rim. He approached me months ago, said he had clients who were willing to pay enormous sums for rare specimens. Rita looked up from her scanner, horrified. You sold children as pets? They're not children, they're Drachnari. Do you have any idea what a fully grown Drachnari sells for on the black market? And these were cubs, young enough to be trained, domesticated. The buyers weren't going to hurt them, they just wanted exotic companions. The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees as Vextar processed this information. His voice, when he spoke, was so quiet it was terrifying. You sold my children to be pets. Now hold on, Jake interrupted, stepping between the increasingly murderous predator and the cowering agent. Commander, I know you want to redecorate this room with Blimbert's internal organs, but we still need him to tell us where your kids are. Grotch operates out of a casino asteroid called Lucky 7, Blimbert babbled, apparently deciding that cooperation was preferable to becoming abstract art. It's in neutral space, Sector 779. The cubs were supposed to be delivered there for auction. That was 3 days ago. Vextar's claws extended with a sound like knives being sharpened. 3 days. My children have been in the hands of slavers for 3 days. Which means they're probably still alive, Jake said, demonstrating either remarkable courage or a complete lack of self-preservation instincts. Merchandise is no good damaged. Rita, what do we know about this Grotch character? Rita was already pulling up files on her datapad, her fingers flying over the interface. Grotch the Collector, real name unpronounceable, species classification Blobrian. Known associates include smugglers, black market dealers, and corrupt officials across 17 systems. Operates primarily in exotic creature trafficking, rare artifacts, and what the database politely calls specialized entertainment services. Specialized entertainment services? I think it means he runs gladiator fights, Rita said, looking distinctly queasy. The silence that followed was the kind that usually precedes someone doing something that creates a lot of paperwork for insurance companies. We're going to Lucky 7. Vextar announced, in the tone of voice that suggested this was not a suggestion. Whoa there, big guy, Jake said, holding up his hands. I'm all for the direct approach, but charging into a criminal stronghold isn't exactly subtle. These people see you coming, the first thing they're going to do is get rid of the evidence. Then what do you suggest, human? Jake grinned, and Rita immediately recognized the expression. It was the same look he got right before he did something that would either be brilliant or get them both killed, sometimes both. We go undercover. 3 hours later, the 3 most unlikely undercover operatives in galactic history were approaching Lucky 7 in a borrowed cargo ship. Jake had managed to acquire what he assured them were totally legitimate identification documents from a contact he refused to name. Rita was disguised as a xenobiologist looking to acquire research specimens, which wasn't really much of a stretch. The challenge was Vextar. I still don't understand why I have to pretend to be your bodyguard, the 7-foot predator grumbled, tugging at the ill-fitting civilian clothing they'd managed to find in his size. Because, Jake explained for the 5th time, rich, eccentric scientists always have bodyguards, and you're the most intimidating thing I've ever seen that isn't actively on fire. Just stand there, look menacing, and try not to kill anyone until I give the signal. What signal? You'll know it when you see it. Lucky 7 was exactly what you'd expect a criminal casino asteroid to look like if you'd never actually seen one but had watched a lot of bad movies. Neon lights, questionable architectural choices, and the kind of atmosphere that made you want to check your wallet every 5 minutes. The clientele was a colorful mix of species, most of whom looked like they had outstanding warrants somewhere. The trio made their way through the main gaming floor, past tables where beings were gambling away their life savings on games that seemed to involve a lot of tentacles and what Jake was pretty sure were minor explosions. Rita was trying very hard not to stare at everything, while Vextar was drawing the kind of attention that suggested most of the patrons were trying to figure out if they'd ever done anything that might have offended a Drachnari. There, Rita whispered, nodding toward a raised platform overlooking the main floor. That has to be Grotch. And indeed it was. Grotch the Collector was, in the most literal sense possible, a blob. A large, purple, gelatinous blob wearing what appeared to be an extremely expensive suit that had been specially tailored to fit something that had no fixed shape. Multiple eye stalks protruded from his mask, constantly scanning the room, while various appendages gestured as he conducted business with a steady stream of unsavory characters. "Okay," Jake murmured. "Here's the plan. Rita, you approach him as a potential buyer. You're looking for something special, something unique. Get him talking about his premium inventory. Vextar, you just stand behind her and try to look like you eat people for breakfast." "I do eat people for breakfast," Vextar pointed out. "Perfect. Just keep doing that." They approached Grotch's platform, where a bouncer the size of a small building was checking credentials. Rita stepped forward, adopting the slightly manic enthusiasm she usually reserved for particularly interesting microorganisms. "Excuse me, I understand you're Groch the Collector? I'm Dr. Rita Kowalski, and I represent some very wealthy clients who are interested in acquiring some truly exceptional specimens." Several of Grouch's eye stalks swiveled to focus on her, while others continued monitoring the casino floor. When he spoke, his voice was like honey mixed with industrial lubricant. "Dr. Kowski, how delightful. And what sort of specimens might your clients be interested in?" "Well," Rita said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "they're particularly interested in predator species. Young ones, if possible. Something that could be trained, domesticated. My clients have very specific tastes." Grouch's form rippled in what might have been amusement. "Ah, a woman after my own heart. I do indeed have some remarkable specimens that have recently come into my possession. Young, healthy, quite rare. But I'm afraid they're not for sale to just anyone. Oh, I assure you, my clients can meet any price." "It's not about price, my dear doctor. It's about discretion. These particular specimens have attracted some unwanted attention. Their previous owner is reportedly quite upset about their relocation." Jake felt Vextar tense behind them, and quickly stepped on the predator's foot, which was like stepping on a tree trunk but apparently got the message across. "I understand completely," Rita continued, "which is why my clients prefer to conduct their business through intermediaries. Perhaps we could view the specimens? I'd need to confirm their health and temperament before making any commitments." Grouch's eye stalks bobbed in what Jake hoped was agreement. Of course, right this way. I think you'll find them quite remarkable. 3 young Draknari cubs, absolutely pristine condition. Quite spirited, but nothing that can't be managed with the proper training." As they followed Groch deeper into the asteroid's interior, Jake couldn't help but notice that Vextar's breathing had taken on a distinctly predatory rhythm, the kind of rhythm that usually preceded something becoming past tense. "Remember," he whispered, "we need to see the cubs first. Once we know they're safe, then you can turn this place into a crime scene." Vextar's response was a growl so low it was felt rather than heard. "They will regret the day they learned to breathe." And as they descended into the bowels of Lucky 7, Jake couldn't help but think that this was either going to be the easiest rescue operation in galactic history, or the messiest. Knowing his luck, it would probably be both. The holding facility beneath Lucky 7 was exactly the kind of place that made you lose faith in sentient civilization. Rows of reinforced containment cells lined a sterile corridor, each one equipped with force fields, atmospheric controls, and what Jake was pretty sure were shock prods. The air hummed with the sound of life support systems and the occasional growl, roar, or unidentifiable alien noise from the various imprisoned creatures. "My private collection," Groch said with obvious pride, his gelatinous mass undulating as he moved down the corridor. "Creatures from across the galaxy, each one worth a fortune to the right buyer. Ah, here we are." He stopped in front of a triple reinforced cell that was larger than the others, clearly designed for something particularly dangerous. Inside, 3 small figures were huddled together in the far corner. Even from a distance, Jake could see the distinctive scaled hide and predatory features that marked them as Draknari. The cubs were smaller than Jake had expected, maybe the size of large dogs, but even in captivity, even clearly scared and confused, there was something unmistakably dangerous about them. Their eyes held an intelligence that was far too advanced for their apparent age, and when they looked up at the approaching group, their expressions were pure predator. Rita gasped softly. "Oh my God, they're just babies." "Babies with retractable claws and bite force that could crush titanium," Groch chuckled. "But yes, quite young. Perhaps 6 months in your Earth years. At this age, they're still trainable, though I must warn you, they've been quite resistant to our conditioning protocols." Jake felt, rather than saw, Vextar's reaction to that statement. The temperature around the Draknari commander seemed to drop several degrees, and Jake was pretty sure he could hear the sound of claws extending. "Conditioning protocols?" Rita asked, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Nothing harmful, I assure you. Simply basic obedience training. Unfortunately, these three seem to have inherited their father's stubborn streak. They refuse to eat, they won't respond to commands, and yesterday they actually managed to short out their cell's security system. Quite clever for such young specimens." That's when Jake noticed something that made his detective instincts start screaming. One of the cubs, the smallest one, was staring directly at Vextar with an expression of desperate hope. The little predator opened its mouth and made a sound that was part whimper, part growl, but unmistakably a call for help. Vextar's response was immediate and instinctive. He made a low, rumbling sound in return, something that was clearly a Draknari comfort call, and the three cubs immediately perked up, scrambling to the front of their cell with excited chittering sounds. Groton's eye stalks swiveled toward Vextar with sudden suspicion. "That's odd. They don't usually respond to other species like that. Your bodyguard seems to have a way with predators, Dr. Kowalski." And that's when Jake realized their cover was about to be blown in the worst possible way. He could see Vextar struggling with every instinct he had, wanting to rush to his children while knowing that premature action could get them all killed. Time to improvise. "Actually," Jake said, stepping forward with his biggest smile, "there's something we should probably mention." Rita looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Jake, what are you doing?" "Being honest. See, Dr. Kowalski here isn't actually a buyer, and I'm not actually her assistant, and our large friend here isn't actually a bodyguard." Grotch's form rippled with what was definitely not amusement this time. Several appendages reached toward what Jake assumed were hidden weapons, while alarms began blaring throughout the facility. "I'm Detective Jake Murphy, Chicago PD. Dr. Kowalski is a xenobiologist working with the Galactic Council, and our friend here," Jake gestured toward Vexar, who had given up all pretense of being anything other than a barely restrained killing machine. "Well, he's Commander Vexar of the Draknari Empire. You know, the guy whose kids you stole." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of security doors slamming shut throughout the facility, and the distinctive whine of weapons powering up. "You magnificent idiots," Grotch wheezed, his form expanding to nearly twice its normal size. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This facility has enough firepower to level a small city. My security systems are automated and programmed to eliminate any threat to my collection." "Yeah, about that," Jake said, pulling out his service weapon. "Here's the thing about human police work, Grotch. We don't actually go into situations like this without backup." As if on cue, the facility shook as something large impacted the asteroid's hull. Then again. Then the lights went out, replaced by emergency illumination that cast everything in an ominous red glow. "That would be the Galactic Council Enforcement Fleet," Rita added helpfully. "Turns out they take a very dim view of kidnapping the children of allied species." Grotch's eye stalks were now focused entirely on them, and Jake could see various weapons emerging from concealed panels in the walls. "It doesn't matter. You'll never make it out alive, and even if you do, those cubs will die with me." That's when Vextar finally spoke, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that made Arctic winds seem warm and friendly. "You made one critical error in your calculations, slaver." "Ooh? And what's that?" "You assumed I came here to rescue my children." Grotch's form rippled with confusion. "Then why?" "I came here to kill you. Rescuing my children is simply a pleasant bonus." What happened next was probably the most educational few minutes in the history of galactic criminal justice. Jake had seen violence before, had been in his share of fights, but he had never seen anything like a Draknari warrior in full combat mode. Vextar didn't just move fast. He moved like physics was more of a suggestion than a law. The first security turret to target him was torn from its mounting before it could fire. The second managed to get off one shot that Vextar caught, crushed, and threw back with enough force to destroy the weapon that fired it. Roach's various appendages were producing an impressive array of weapons, from plasma rifles to sonic disruptors, but none of them seemed designed to deal with something that treated high-tech security systems like minor inconveniences. "Jake!" Rita shouted, over the sound of destruction and Grotch's increasingly panicked burbling. "The cubs." "Right." While Vextar was demonstrating why his species had conquered half the galaxy, Jake and Rita had a job to do. The cell's security system was flickering as the facility's power grid struggled with the ongoing battle, and Jake could see the force field weakening. "Rita, can you get that door open?" "Working on it." She was bent over the control panel, her scanner interface plugged into the system. "These security protocols are incredibly complex, but I think I can—" The force field collapsed just as a stray plasma bolt from one of Grotch's weapons took out the backup power grid. The three cubs scrambled out of their cell and immediately made a beeline for their father, who was currently using a security robot as an improvised club against two more security robots. "Okay," Jake muttered, watching the reunion unfold amid the chaos of the ongoing battle. "This is either really heartwarming or absolutely terrifying." It turned out to be both. The moment Vexstar saw his children were safe, his fighting style shifted from controlled destruction to complete annihilation. What had been a remarkably efficient dismantling of Grotch's security systems became something that resembled a natural disaster with claws. Groch, for his part, was discovering that being a gelatinous blob had some distinct disadvantages when facing something designed by evolution to hunt and kill. His various weapons were impressive, but they were designed to intimidate and control, not to fight something that viewed overwhelming firepower as a minor obstacle. "Enough!" Groch finally shrieked. His form contracted around what looked like a dead man's switch. "One more step and I'll trigger the facility's self-destruct. We'll all die together." Vexstar paused, his cubs pressed against his legs, and fixed the crime lord with a stare that could have frozen supernovas. "You would kill yourself rather than face justice? I'd rather die than spend the rest of my life in a Galactic Council prison." That's when Rita spoke up from where she was still working at the control console. "Actually, about that self-destruct system?" Everyone turned to look at her. She was holding up a handful of disconnected circuits and looking apologetic. "I may have accidentally disabled it while I was hacking the door controls. Sorry. Science habit. When I see interconnected systems, I tend to poke at them until I understand how they work." The expression on Grouch's face, or what passed for a face on a gelatinous blob, was absolutely priceless. "So," Jake said, holstering his weapon and pulling out his handcuffs, "Grouch the Collector, you're under arrest for kidnapping, trafficking in sentient beings, operating an illegal gambling establishment, and probably about 17 other things I'll think of once the paperwork starts. Rita, are you getting all this on your scanner?" "Every bit," she confirmed, grinning. "This is going to make the best research paper ever." As Galactic Council security forces finally breached the facility and began the process of securing the scene, Jake couldn't help but notice that Vexstar hadn't moved from where he was kneeling with his three cubs pressed against him, making those same rumbling comfort sounds. For all his reputation as a galactic boogeyman, watching him with his children, the Draknari commander looked exactly like what he was, a father who had just gotten his kids back. Which, Jake reflected as he watched the reunion, was probably the most human thing he'd seen all day. 2 hours later, they were back aboard the Galactic Council vessel, and Jake was discovering that Draknari cubs were basically small, scaled versions of puppies. Except puppies didn't have retractable claws, bite force that could dent titanium, or the ability to purr at frequencies that made your bones vibrate. The smallest cub, who Vexstar had introduced as Kexley, had apparently decided that Rita was the most fascinating thing in the universe, and kept trying to examine her scanner with the kind of curiosity that suggested intelligence far beyond her apparent age. "She's going to be a scientist," Rita said, gently extricating her equipment from tiny but incredibly strong claws. "Look at how she's trying to understand how this works." "All Draknari cubs are naturally curious," Vexter explained, though Jake noticed the pride in his voice. "It is how we learn to hunt, to survive, to adapt. But Kexley has always been particularly investigative." "Takes after her old man," Jake observed, watching as the other two cubs, Vexnari and Drakton, had discovered that human shoelaces were apparently the most entertaining toys in the galaxy. The formal debriefing had been mercifully brief. Agent Blimbert was in custody, facing charges that would probably keep him locked up until the heat death of the universe. Groch was in an even smaller cell, and his entire operation was being systematically dismantled by Council forces. The various creatures in his collection were being returned to their homeworlds or, in cases where that wasn't possible, relocated to proper conservation facilities. All in all, it was what Jake would normally consider a successful case, but something about the way the council members kept looking at them suggested there was more to this story. "Detective Murphy," Chancellor Vorpnek said, his tentacles writhing in what Jake had learned was the equivalent of nervous fidgeting. "The council would like to express its gratitude for your assistance in this matter." "Just doing our job, Chancellor." "Yes, well, that's precisely what we find so remarkable. You see, this case had stumped our best investigators for days. Our most advanced forensic techniques, our most sophisticated analysis protocols, our most experienced agents, all failed to make progress. And yet, you and Dr. Kowalski solved it in a matter of hours using what you called common sense?" Jake shrugged. "Sometimes the simple answer is the right answer." "But that's just it. Ambassador Trillnox interjected, her crystalline form shimmering with what Jake had come to recognize as confusion. Nothing about this case was simple. The security systems involved, the forensic analysis required, the investigation of financial records, and communication intercepts that should have taken weeks. Yeah, but at the end of the day it was just a guy with access selling kids to creeps for money, Jake said. Oldest story in the book. The only thing that made it complicated was everyone assuming it had to be complicated. Vexstar, who had been quietly watching his cubs explore their new environment, looked up at the assembled dignitaries. The humans did something you did not. They treated my children as children, not as political complications. What do you mean? Vorpik asked. When Agent Blimbert briefed you on the disappearance, what was the first thing you all considered? The silence that followed was telling. You thought about diplomatic ramifications, Vexstar continued, about trade relationships, about military alliances, about how the Draknari Empire might respond to the loss. You saw a potential political crisis. Well, yes, but the humans saw 3 scared children who needed to come home. Jake felt a slight blush creeping up his neck. Come on, Commander, that's just... No, Detective Murphy, it is not just anything. It is the difference between your species and the rest of the galaxy. Vexstar stood, his cubs automatically arranging themselves around his feet. Do you know what my advisors told me when we first received word that the Council was sending human investigators? I'm guessing it wasn't a glowing endorsement. They said humans were primitive, unpredictable, and dangerously emotional. They said your species lacked the sophistication to handle complex galactic politics. They recommended I refuse your assistance. Rita looked up from where she was showing Kexley how her scanner worked. So why didn't you? Because, Vexstar said, and for the first time since Jake had met him, the Draknari commander actually smiled. I remembered something about human military history that my advisors seemed to have forgotten. What's that? Promised human. Humans are the only species in galactic records to have fought wars over the principle that some things are simply wrong, regardless of political convenience or economic benefit. Your species has repeatedly chosen to fight battles you could not win, against enemies you could not defeat, simply because you believed it was the right thing to do. Jake was starting to feel distinctly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. Commander, we're just cops. We solve crimes. We catch bad guys. We go home. It's not that deep. Isn't it? Vexstar asked. You came here knowing nothing about Draknari culture, nothing about galactic politics, nothing about the complex web of alliances and obligations that govern interactions between species. All you knew was that 3 children were missing and needed to be found. That's pretty much it. And when you discovered that the investigation was being hindered by corruption, you didn't consider the political ramifications of exposing a Galactic Council agent. When you learned where my cubs were being held, you didn't calculate the diplomatic cost of infiltrating a neutral space criminal operation. You simply did what needed to be done. Vexstar walked over to stand directly in front of Jake, and for a moment the detective was reminded exactly why this particular species had conquered half the galaxy. But when the Draknari spoke, his voice was gentle. Detective Murphy, Dr. Kowalski, on behalf of my family, my clan, and my people, I offer you the highest honor the Draknari Empire can bestow. You are hereby named Kithvar, Protectors of the Young. It is a title that has never before been granted to non-Draknari. Wow. Thank you, Commander. That's really... It also comes with certain privileges, Vexstar continued, and Jake detected what might have been amusement in his voice. Should you ever need the assistance of the Draknari Empire, you need only ask. Should anyone threaten you or those you protect, they will answer to us. And should you ever find yourselves in need of allies, you will always have a place among our people. Rita looked like she was about to cry. Commander, we can't possibly... You can, and you will, because that is what humans do. You help, even when it costs you. You protect, even when it's dangerous. You do the right thing, even when it's inconvenient. He looked around at the assembled council members. It is a trait that the rest of the galaxy would do well to emulate. Jake cleared his throat, trying to figure out how to respond to what was probably the most meaningful thing anyone had ever said to him in his 20-year career. Commander, thank you, really, but you know what? We didn't do anything special. Any cop worth his badge would have done the same thing. Any decent person would have done the same thing. Yes, Vexstar said, his smile widening to show far too many sharp teeth. That is precisely my point. As the formal ceremony concluded, and they prepared to return to Earth, Jake found himself thinking about what the Draknari commander had said. Maybe humans weren't the strongest species in the galaxy, or the smartest, or the most technologically advanced. Maybe they were just the ones who, when faced with a choice between doing what was convenient and doing what was right, consistently chose right. And honestly, Jake thought, as he watched Rita trying to explain human coffee to 3 fascinated Drakari cubs while their father looked on with obvious affection, maybe that wasn't such a bad reputation to have. After all, in a galaxy full of beings who could manipulate matter at the molecular level, travel between dimensions, and calculate the trajectories of entire star systems, sometimes what you really needed was someone stubborn enough to look at a complex problem and say, yeah, but have you tried just asking the obvious questions? Which, when you got right down to it, was probably the most human thing of all.